Welcome to the All for Literacy podcast, hosted by Dr. Liz Brooke, welcoming established and emerging voices in literacy education and the science of reading. Explore with us the connections between literacy research, educators' knowledge and skills, and the implementation into classroom instruction.
It's not like teaching in a monolingual classroom, so you have to be really strategic about learning more about your students, their educational background, their culture, and their interests.
You just heard from Daniella Bass, the English Learners Coordinator at DeKalb County School District, Georgia. Today, Daniella joins Dr. Liz Brooke to discuss her experience as an educator in the most culturally and linguistically diverse district in the country. Here's your host, Liz Brooke.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on the All for Literacy podcast. We're coming together to connect new and established research with the educators who apply those ideas daily in our schools. And as we work to improve access to effective literacy education, it's essential that information and conversation flows both ways, from research to the classroom and the classroom experience back to the researchers. So today, I am joined by Daniella Bass, an English Learners Coordinator at DeKalb County School District. It's Georgia's most culturally and linguistically diverse county. So welcome, Daniella, and thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Hi, Liz. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I like to start these conversations by just talking about what sparked your interest in education.
So it's really funny. I always tell people I never imagined myself being a teacher. When I went to school, I actually originally went to school for sociology and international affairs, and I was really into learning about kind of what was going on in and around the world. And I eventually moved to the Netherlands to study there for a bit, and then I started working with refugees there. And when I moved back here, I started working at a local nonprofit called New American Pathways, and it was there that I was a AmeriCorps member, and I was asked to work in the schools as an after-school tutor for English and reading. And that was kind of working with those students, those newcomers, kind of sparked my interest in education. I grew instantly attached to working with that population, and eventually that led me to wanting to become an educator.
Wow. So, and that's what we've heard a lot, is that sometimes, even if it wasn't your original thought to be a teacher, an experience like a volunteer or after school program. So what was the pathway you took after your experience with that program and newcomers in particular?
So after I was done with AmeriCorps, actually I did a few years as an after-school instructors in the programs there at the nonprofit. And then eventually I thought to myself, well, if I enjoy this so much, why don't I just make this my career? So I went to Georgia State and I got my MAT in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and with the hopes of working within the same community I was already serving, which was in the Clarkson area. If you're not familiar with it, it's considered the most diverse area. I think certain amount of square miles in the entire country, from my understanding. So I started teaching I did my student teaching at a Clarkson High School, which was in the community that I wanted to be in. And someone told me that when they did some redistricting, that some of the students from the Clarkson community were going to Stone Mountain High School, and teachers and the faculty and staff there weren't as familiar with working with the refugee population. They said they could really use someone like you to help this new population that went there. And then I guess the rest is kind of where I stayed for the rest of my teaching career. I led the International Student Club, and I worked really hard to ensure that everyone in that community welcomed these students. So that's kind of what led me to this. Yeah.
Wow. And you mentioned DeKalb County being one of the most diverse, and I think in 2009, the UN Refugee Agency recognized DeKalb as being one of the largest resettlement communities in the United States, as you said, and in the district's efforts to serve those students. So how does that history of having such a large resettlement community shape your larger learning community in DeKalb?
Yeah, so I definitely think having a large refugee and immigrant community changes the way that we have to do teaching and learning. Currently, we have over 174 languages and dialects, and 160 and students from 167 different countries. Most of the time, I had at least over 35 languages. So, even if you think of it from a language and a literacy perspective, that the word order and all of that is different in all of these languages.
Right.
So it's not like teaching in a monolingual classroom where all of your students speak Spanish and you can rely on certain phrases that are similar in Spanish as they are to English, or phonemes and all of that. You can't rely on any of that as much when you're teaching in a very multilinguistic, multicultural classroom. So you have to be really strategic about learning more about your students, their educational background, their culture, and their interests, because in order to engage them in the learning process, it takes a lot more than just, when you would have one or, only a few different cultures in your classroom.
Yeah. So when you are working with students with such an incredible range and diverse backgrounds and experiences, how do you try to build that sense of connection or shared experience?
Yeah, so I think, luckily I thank my experience at the refugee agency, because I think a lot of that was stuff that I learned from that work. Because when I was working in that role, not only did I teach in the after school programs, but I also helped with resettlement. I would pick people up from the airport. I would set up apartments. I would do home visits. I would do everything from teaching how to use the thermostat to helping you apply for citizenship. It was just everything and anything in between. And a lot of these families became, friends, and some of them even considered me part of their family. I was at their Eid, I was at weddings, all sorts of things. So I think being a part of that community really gave me something that I feel like I wouldn't have had if I didn't have this experience coming into it. Understanding kind of like how to listen and learn. It's not just knowing the culture, because obviously they all have different lived experiences, but understanding kind of like how to just kind of be a participant in a situation and just learn from those around you. I think that's also an important part. As far as teaching, I think, you need to be strategic about what kind of books you have your students read. I really like a book called Green Card Youth Voices, and they are personal narratives, and they have them for different cities. There's one for Atlanta, and it's in they are students from Clarkson, Cross Keys, and the International Student Center, which are all DeKalb schools. And they're short narratives that the students wrote about their American dream, their hopes, their futures, where they came from. And they also have recordings of it. So reading stuff like that and then having my students engage in that and tell their own stories. So building a sense of community is kind of honoring your students, their cultures, their backgrounds, and allowing them to make connections with each other. Because they would say, oh yeah, that, I understand that. I have that same experience. Even if it's not the same, a similar experience that you do. Right. Because of this, so having your students and that requires, like I said, building relationships with your students, creating a safe place for your students to feel vulnerable enough to share these things about themselves.
Wow. And we'll definitely note the book you mentioned in the show notes. So you said it was called Green Card Youth Centers?
Green Card Youth Voices.
Oh, Youth Voices. I love that. And so having them read about other people's American dreams and their experiences, and then having them write their own, even if it doesn't ultimately become a published book, but to share that with the classroom. And you said something that's so important is being a good listener and understanding, really as you're talking, it's more about the whole child and the whole family, really, not just the subjects, 9 to 3 in the school day. And so that background experience that you could bring to your students is so powerful. I think teachers out there that are listening, when you think about, you might have 160 different countries that these students come from, and 80 or 90 different languages, but what are those common experiences, even if they're not exactly the same, but coming to a new country and all of that. So I think that aspect is so important. And definitely we'll have our listeners check out that Green Card Youth Voices. That sounds like an amazing resource. Now, in May, we spoke to Natalie Wexler, who's the author of The Knowledge Gap. And she talked all about the role, that both content knowledge and background knowledge play in both reading comprehension and assessment, really, of your reading comprehension ability. So, and we know for sure that it also impacts our newcomers, and particularly students coming from areas of conflict. So how do you think about that concept, the areas of content knowledge and background knowledge? How does that impact your classroom or your approach to teaching?
Certainly. So firstly, like you were kind of saying, like, thinking about those shared experiences, kind of going back to that, some of these students have never been to school. Or if they went to school, it may have been in a refugee camp, and it was just like someone who volunteered to teach them how to read, right? And it wasn't very formal. So we do have a lot of, as we call them, SLIFE, students with interrupted or limited education. We have students who have experienced trauma and have missed certain parts of education. We have students who don't have literacy skills, who don't have any background knowledge to draw on from their first language, right? So for example, I had a student who was from Afghanistan, and she could not read in her home language. So she couldn't read in English or her home language. So when I was teaching her how to read, it was like I was teaching her how to read for the first time, which is very different than if you're bilingual, you can transfer those skills from learning English to the target language that you're trying to learn. Even if the word order is a little bit different, you still have the skill set, that toolbox, that background knowledge of how to read. So that's the first thing. And the content knowledge, that's kind of a similar thing, making sure that you develop a curriculum and you develop activities and lessons that that are part of their, hold on, let me say that again. Making sure you develop lessons and curriculum that do take into account their background knowledge, right? So that could look like, if I am doing a lesson on persuasive speeches, right? I might want to use something that they know, right? When I'm trying to teach them about those speeches. So let's argue about who's the best soccer team, right? My kids most of my kids play soccer. They love soccer. So before we even try to learn how to do this on what the curriculum is asking us to do, we're going to sit here and we're going to argue over what's better, TikTok or YouTube, right? So the things that they're interested in, that doesn't even have to be something that's their culture, right? They're kids, right. They're teenagers, right? So whatever they're interested in, and having them learn how to do that with something they already have the knowledge of, right? Because otherwise, if you're giving them something that's talking about, Johnny and Susie going camping Well, going camping may not be something that's in their repertoire. So that's something that you would need to take in consideration when you're picking out materials and developing lessons for your students.
Absolutely. I love that. And that idea that if you're trying to teach them, like you said, the skill and they don't know the content, then it's a double whammy on their cognitive load, so to speak. So that idea that trying to engage, I love the TikTok versus YouTube, or let's describe who has the best soccer team. So those are all really, really important factors to consider. And again, thinking about, teenagers, earlier this year, in fact, our first episode of season 2, we talked to Dr. Sharon Vaughn and Dr. Jeannie Wanzik about their research around adolescent literacy. And so you mentioned, middle schoolers or high schoolers, and really they talked about not thinking about just reading one period a day, but really throughout the day, all the content area teachers, including, 5 to 10 minutes a day on introducing definitions or how they might pronounce them, engage them in the word meeting. So can you build upon kind of what you were just talking about, but can you build upon what other strategies you found effective throughout, like science or social studies, or how do you help work with your content area teachers so they can include some of these strategies throughout their day?
Certainly, yeah. So, I mean, one thing, as in my new role at the district, I work a lot with teachers with SIOP, for example. I don't know if you've heard of the SIOP model, but it's a Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. We like to say that it's not just for English learners, but it's good teaching and good practices for all students. And I think that's one thing that when I was working, because I was a department chair back when I was still teaching, and I taught ninth grade sheltered lit and world lit. And I did have some teachers in my department who were from different subjects like biology, and they would come to me asking for support. And honestly, like a lot of the things I would do, especially for my SLIVE students and my newcomers, I'm like, well, you need to look at the standard and you need to look at what you want your students to understand. So if I'm trying to get my student, I'm teaching history and we're doing a unit and we're talking about religion. So figure out what your student already knows about religion, right? Maybe get them talk about their religion, read about their religion, and then have them work with someone else so you can do that. So, try to find some sort of connection, background knowledge, as we were talking about, that student could have to the thing. And then the other thing really is I think, especially as a secondary teacher, I know a lot of teachers, think, okay, well, the ELA teachers teach the reading. But we know, in fact, that, I have a reading endorsement, but most high school level teachers or secondary level teachers aren't taught to teach reading. And I think that is something that definitely needs to be addressed in the current, state that we're in, with a lot of students struggling with reading. So I think, definitely my advice would always be for especially, working with ELs is, learn how to use SIOP and work with your ESOL lead. If you're not an ESOL teacher and you have these students in your class, work with others in your building that can help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often hear that, right? Like you said, from science or social studies teacher. I'm not a reading teacher, but we also know that 85% or more of the curriculum in science and social studies is taught via reading. So really everybody is a reading teacher. And that's kind of what Dr. Vaughn and Wanzik were trying to get at. And so again, I think for folks, so the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, the SIOP that you were mentioning, it's similar to some of the things we've talked about, right? It's beneficial for all, but essential for our emergent bilinguals or multilinguals. So that's really helpful for teachers and content area teachers in particular. And I think thinking about it as small things they can infuse throughout their day, again, that are going to be beneficial. And a big part of it does revolve around that background knowledge and making sure that when they're trying to teach a skill or a concept, that there's some base level knowledge there, and do a little preparation and pre-teaching perhaps, right? So that's really great advice. So continuing on the theme to support our teachers, for teachers who are not in districts with programs like DeKalb, who may have either individuals or a small resettlement community, what's the first thing? I mean, maybe you said learning more about the PSYOP model, but where can they start to understand the unique needs of this student population? Are there any resources or websites or podcasts out there that you might recommend for them?
So far as websites go, like when I was first learning how to teach, I really like Color in Colorado. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yep.
That's a really great resource. I used things like Lexia and Newsella and things like that because it was really hard, especially if you're a secondary teacher, to find things that are both relevant but also in multiple levels to differentiate for all the students in my classroom. But as far as learning how to work with those students, because, I have a lot of teachers who come to me, they're just like, I've never worked with English learners before. What do I do? It's understandable because it's a new experience for both the student and the teacher. I think and I know I keep talking about this, but I think it's really important for you to first build relationships with your students and their families. And that could mean going out in the community, going to different events. I just recently went to the graduation of my students who just graduated. I'll go to Ethiopian New Year. I'll go to the Karen New Year. Just going and being present, even if it's just going to your students' basketball games, but building that relationship with them, learning more about them so you can leverage those funds of knowledge that really helps you with teaching them. And then again, I know I already mentioned the PSYOP model, but, ensuring that you're chunking the information in a way that your students can understand and giving them multiple exposures to that language that you want them to learn and what you want them to read. And then, of course, honoring and allowing them to use their L1 is something that's really important. I think sometimes misunderstood.
Yeah. And I'd love to hear more about that last comment you made about the L1 and making sure that we honor that and have them still leverage their strengths in L1. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that. And then also, I loved all those examples of, whether it's going to celebrate a holiday or a basketball game. Can you talk a little bit more too about how you try to engage specifically with the parents? So building the relationship you mentioned with both the student and the family. So maybe we'll start first with kind of engaging with the parents, and then we'll come back to the L1 comment.
Of course, yes. So definitely this is something that, as you probably already know, that researchers talk about a lot, is how do we engage our multilingual families, right? It is definitely something that is not very easy. That's why I always say kind of going into the community is the best way for me. At least I've had more success going into the community with meeting the parents and engaging the parents than I have bringing them to the school. Although I have had some come to the school at the younger level, I've definitely had more experience with that. But even just having an event, like when I was at Clarkson, they put on a really great international show, and they have something called the Taste of Clarkson, and the kids make the food and people from the community come. So just having things where, like I was kind of saying, utilizing their funds of knowledge again, they're cooking, their dance, their, everything. And that kind of brings the community to the school, or even allowing, like, I know I recently had someone in one of my professional learning sessions who was telling me about how she engaged families to come to her school by having an international game night where the families came with games from their culture and taught people how to play the different games that they played.
Oh, I love
And I thought that
that.
was a very unique idea. So, I think, trying to do things that give the parents an opportunity to also show what they know, because sometimes, as a, as a daughter of an immigrant, I know sometimes, you don't understand school. School might be different from what it was in your home. Maybe you don't really engage in school, so you don't know how to engage in school. And then, of course, if you don't know English, that creates another barrier. So that would be, if you give them activities to do or give them an opportunity to share, that kind of extends your arm to them. Like, oh, we want to hear from you. You're the expert in this. You know what I'm saying?
Right. So, so important to, again, similar to how we think about the students, we want to leverage their assets, right, and their strengths. And so absolutely in some cultures and countries, school is not a place where parents go, right? It is not something that they interact with. So it's absolutely trying to find the right opportunity for them to feel comfortable and them to feel like the expert at school. So I love the idea of a game night or cooking different types of food. And also, as you've been saying, which is really important to think about, and even more important, working with our students who have been, as you said, have experienced trauma, have been resettled in a different country, making sure you get out into their communities. So let's go back to the comment about L1 and staying on the thread of leveraging assets and building on their strengths. Why, or how do you recommend teachers, working with all ages, but especially I think it's really helpful. We don't often get as much as advice for our upper grade teachers. So how do we honor their L1 and make sure to leverage their assets?
Yeah, so I think when I'm doing activities with my students, and as I told you, I had over 35 languages or plus in my classroom. So I didn't always have two students who spoke the same language, but when I did, sometimes I would let them work with each other if they wanted to. And I know sometimes people are like, oh, no, they need to be speaking English, but sometimes they need to use their L1, because kind of like how I was referring to, like, my second language is Dutch. And when I was learning Dutch, I relied on skills I had from English to help me learn Dutch. So it's kind of the same concept when you think about it. And that could mean even writing. You could have them translanguage. I'm sure you've heard of this word, where they write something in part English and part their L1. You could have them have conversation with students in it while they're in their L1, but have them write it in English, right? So they're using that to support them. So it's more of it's supporting them, right? But I think sometimes people think, oh no, they shouldn't speak anything but English in our class. But the reality is that actually helps them more than you think it would. And not allowing them to use that language can actually make it more difficult for them.
Right. So, yes, I think even the researchers who are experts in this field have talked about how we used to think about it as a hard code switch, right, and shifting over. But the translanguaging, as you referenced, is about melding the strengths of L1 as they're learning English. And so allowing them, to your point, what they're finding in the research, allowing them to benefit from the strengths they have will actually improve English as well as so it is something that I think it's good to hear from you, so teachers are understanding that they don't have to have this hard cutoff and just use English, but to leverage that. And then to your point, if you have 2 students or 3 students who might speak the same language, allowing them to partner up and work on activities is a great idea. So these are all amazing, very practical ideas for our teachers. I know you mentioned Coloring Colorado, so we will put that in our show notes as well. It's a great website for those teachers who know Reading Rockets. It's the partner site to that, focused on our emergent bilinguals and our English learners. Do you have other particular resources you wanted to mention for any teachers that might be interested?
Yeah, so I think, so for example, when we're working on our cultural awareness PLs and our intensive English, I always recommend looking at refugee backgrounders kind of as a starting point. Like, as I said, like, not all your students' experience are going to be the same, but at least it gives you an understanding of where they're coming from and some of their customs and norms, right? So even something as simple as eye contact, or maybe what happened, what conflict happened, why might they be here, right? That's kind of, to me, the first step. So I know that OLR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, sorry, has some refugee backgrounds, or you can look at things like, if you're, in Georgia, there's 6 or 7 different refugee agencies that you could volunteer at that I know of, including the one I worked at, which is New American Pathways, but International Rescue Committee is kind of a bigger one. And you can kind of find that one more around. So if you're interested in kind of learning more about these communities or working with them, I recommend looking into those as well.
Excellent. And we can link those websites and resources that you've been sharing with us today. As we've talked about this, there's plenty of challenges in the classroom, but also really tremendous forward momentum and just so many amazing opportunities to get to know our children and their families and think about the whole child, right? And really leveraging their assets. So as you think about all of that, especially with this really important population, especially our students who have been resettled, what makes you most hopeful for the future of literacy with these students and just in general with these students?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot more research on working with refugee students in life than there was when I first started teaching. So that makes me hopeful. I also think that there are more resources for teaching English learners. So I think it's great that they're coming out with more culturally responsive and culturally relevant texts for our students to engage with. So I think that's what makes me very hopeful, is that we are developing not only more, research behind how to educate these students, but we're also developing more resources that honor who they are.
Absolutely. And that are designed specifically with them in mind and not just trying to modify another program, but specifically designed for them with the culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And as you said, having something that helps the teachers differentiate the instruction for the students who could be at 6 or 7 different reading levels is so important. So what makes me hopeful is that all our teachers listening to you today will have more practical ideas and practical resources that they can go check out. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I know our listeners are going to benefit greatly from your expertise.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope everyone learned a little bit more about this population that I hold so special to my heart.
Absolutely. I know I did, and I'm sure our listeners have. And thanks so much to our listeners for joining Daniella and me today. There is so much we can learn by speaking directly to educators like you, Daniella, in classrooms nationwide. So I'd love to hear from our listeners what conversations are happening in your community today. Let us know by joining the conversation on LinkedIn. Our profiles are linked in the podcast description. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.